Right. Good morning, everyone. Oh, sorry. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Bay Planning Coalition's 2022-2023 legislative program. My name is Amara Morrison, and I'm co-chair of the BPC's Government Affairs Committee, along with my co-chair, Christian Marsh. Just a brief note about the Government Affairs Committee. We're a very active committee that tracks state legislation, state and federal regulations and guidance that may affect our members from introduction to adoption. And when necessary, provide input on bills to legislators and have been instrumental in getting legislation that could potentially have been adverse to the interests of our members amended for the better. We invite you to join us for next year's programs. We've got really great staff. Shout out to Sophie and Cameron and John for all of your help this past year. And if you're not yet a member of the BPC, I would ask that you consider joining. We did a lot of work this year, and 2023 promises to be even a better year. Turning to this morning's program, we are going to be provided with a recap of both California and the Fed's 2022 legislative session, as well as being provided some forecasting about what 2023 holds for both the state and the federal legislative sessions. We're delighted to have with us this morning Gary Lux, who is a partner with the Bay Law Group and who is an environmental attorney with expertise in environmental health and safety law. Gary has written environmental policy briefing papers for Governor Newsom, Senators Feinstein and Steinberg, as well as others. He's a published author and co-wrote the book, California Environmental Law and Policy, A Practical Guide. And Gary this morning will be addressing California's 2022 legislative session, as well as forecasting 2023 for us. We're also joined by Eric Sapirstein with ENS Resources, who will provide us with the federal 2022 recap and 2023 outlook. Eric is the founder and president of ENS, which is a firm focused on legislative and regulatory affairs consulting for local and regional government, as well as private sector clients, which are concerned with environmental protection and sustainability. Eric previously worked at the US EPA's office and is a frequent and welcome speaker here at the BPC. Following the recaps and the outlooks, Eric and Gary will participate in a discussion moderated by Tim McRae, who is the Silicon Valley Leadership Group Senior VP for Climate. Tim is an expert on clean energy policy and is frequently quoted in local print and radio, and we welcome him as our moderator today. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your participation this morning. And with that, with these introductions, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Gary.
Great, just want to make sure. Well, welcome everyone. Good morning, and thanks for joining us today. There's a lot to share about what happened this last legislative session. And even though it was an election year where you don't expect a lot of heavy lifting, usually in non-election years where that usually happens, this was a prolific year yielding lots of interesting environmental policy, particularly in the climate space. So I'll share a lot of that with you. There's so much to cover, but because of your interest, I've curtailed the subject area to your main areas of focus, but there's other areas that I suspect you might be interested in as well. We might cover that in the Q&A. So you heard my bio, so I'll move past that. The legislative outcome is just quite prolific, even in a election or non-election year here in California with a full-time legislature. And for the last 30 plus years, I've been writing and summarizing the details of the legislative sessions in different articles. And my most recent article, as you see there on the right, is in the California Lawyers Association's publication, the Environmental Law News. And the publication came out last summer addressing the 2021 legislative session where the bills became effective on January 1st. So if you'd like a copy of that, I can get you a copy, unless Sophie, you provided a copy, I'm not sure, but in either event, we'll make sure you get a copy if you're interested. And I'll be working on the next article reflecting what just will become law January 1st of this year for the 2022 session. And please let me know if you'd like a copy of that forthcoming article as well. So much of what drives the policy is really the sentiment by the public, of course. And in a recent Public Policy Institute poll this summer, you can see where the California electorate really has landed. And these are largely by climate, which is responsible for impacts with the drought and wildfires. And the top two issues are water supply and drought, and wildfire related to climate. And the overarching theme is climate crisis. And that has been reflected this year very much in enacted laws that become effective in just next month or early January. So the mega drought is on the minds of the electorate, with more than 3/4 believing that climate is causing that, and that 90% of the likely voters who showed up last November believe that the environment is a top issue. And that was reflected in the re-election of the governor, who received a 59% approval rating for his environmental policies. And he also, Governor Newsom, received a relatively high score for a governor by the California environmental voters, which used to be the League of Conservation Voters, with hovering in the low to mid 80s. And our legislature is dominated by Democrats, and has been for a long time, with majorities for decades and supermajorities recently, and even more recently, ultra supermajorities that are in both the Senate and the Assembly chambers. And that, of course, has a lot to do with the policies that are yielded in Sacramento. And so the policies are reflecting what's on the mind of the voters, and climate, as I mentioned, is a big focus. We'll cover that. We'll cover hazardous waste and materials developments and enforcement. There are other developments from Department of Toxic Substances Control, agency reform, PFAS, and others that I don't plan to cover, but we can address that in the Q&A if you have interest. So the areas of coverage are broad, and again, we'll cover a subset here. And let's begin by looking at the landscape of decarbonization in California. California has been a bellwether, leading in this area among all the states, and has set ambitious carbon reduction strategies. And what we're going to cover here is just the landscape prior to this legislative session, just as a starting point. AB 32 started it off, and SB 32 moved it forward. And the goals are to reduce carbon by 40% below the 1990 levels by the end of this decade. And that's an interim step towards a more ambitious goal, which now is carbon neutrality, which in this legislative session codified the carbon neutral goal to be achieved by the year 2045. And we'll talk more about that shortly. We have renewable portfolio standards for the investor-owned utilities, which are quite ambitious, calling for 100% renewables by the same time frame for neutrality in 2045. Ambitious goals to introduce zero emission vehicles to California roadways by up to 5 million at the end of this decade, and then eliminating the internal combustion engine sales by 2035, advancing sales for trucks that are electrified by ensuring that 50% of new trucks will be electric by the 2035 timeframe, cutting petroleum use in half, and electrifying our appliances. All of this is the landscape, and carbon neutrality is the big focus that changed this session. This session was also unique in the sense that the coffers were receiving significant windfalls with historic budget surpluses of over $50 billion that's focused primarily on carbon resiliency. Those investments are being placed into fighting sea level rise, mitigating wildfire, protecting against extreme heat, and managing this historic mega drought that we're experiencing. So not only did the windfall go to climate resiliency, but also is investing in the green infrastructure for electric charging, including incentives for purchasing new electric vehicles and buses.
Hey, Gary,
Yeah.
real quick, we can't see your screen.
Oh, no. Showing up on mine. Let's see. Let me try again. Do you see it now?
Yep, now we can see it.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. It was working before we started. Okay. All right, so let me just pick up where we were. Okay, so this is where we're talking about the historic windfall and money going to climate resiliency, green infrastructure, and also investments in solar and energy storage systems, and then a big focus on investing in natural strategies for sequestering carbon in natural and working lands. There's several budget bills, including trailer bill, that implemented these policies, including AB 205, which also dedicates money for energy storage and the grid reliability. And in addition to funding, AB 205 establishes an overarching permitting program to bring clean energy and energy storage projects into reality, with the California Energy Commission serving as the overarching agency for that to happen, and overriding authority by cities, counties, the Coastal Commission, and the BCDC. So the Energy Commission will play a big role in bringing about clean energy and energy storage projects through a permit streamlining process. The governor stepped into the legislative process this summer in an unusual effort to try to bring forward a lot of the climate policies that did become law. Usually the governor steps out of the process, but the governor was quite involved this legislative session. And during this session, he established 5 pillars oriented to increasing renewable energy, addressing safety around oil well activity, advancing these carbon sequestration, carbon capture, carbon removal technologies, codifying the carbon neutrality standard I mentioned in the beginning, and an attempt to further decarbonize against the 1990 standards, but that effort did not succeed. So I'm going to just go into a little bit more detail on some of these climate policies, noting that almost 40 climate bills were approved this session, which is quite a bounty. SB 905 doubles down on the concept of carbon removal, carbon capture, and carbon sequestration. So much effort has been focused on trying to prevent carbon from entering the atmosphere, but there's such a large concentration and amounts of carbon that the effort with the Air Resources Board scoping plan and California policy is to really focus now on how do we remove it, how do we sequester it, and how do we capture it from industrial activities. So SB 905 is a bill that establishes a framework for the Air Resources Board to streamline the adoption of technologies that will remove carbon, capture it, and sequester it. So this is a effort in addition to SB 205 that will streamline carbon storage and renewable projects. SB 1314 weighs into the process, and it prohibits injecting carbon in concentrated amounts and using it for enhanced oil recovery. 2045, as I mentioned before, is the legislation, now the statute that codifies what was the executive order calling for carbon neutrality by 2045. It's known as the California Climate Crisis Act. And a big part of the implementation will be in the Air Resources Board's scoping plan, which has been underway in its newest 2022 edition for quite a while with a bit of controversy. The final scoping plan is now ready for approval by the Air Resources Board. They're meeting to review it in just 2 weeks on December 15th. If approved, it will focus quite heavily on the carbon capture, removal, and sequestration policies. And if in its current form it becomes the policy, it will dramatically reduce the demand for liquid petroleum fuels by 94% by the mid-century mark, and almost 90% of greenhouse gas reduction from oil and gas extraction by 2045 as well. It's almost a 300-page document. I think most of us would benefit by taking a look at it and noting that in the key sectors, it touches on most areas of industrial activity and other activity in California, from transportation to the grid to sustainable buildings and manufacturing and so on. And a lot of what the scoping plan addresses is really a blueprint for possible statewide rules and regulations. So it is the blueprint worth a look because it might impact your activities. I mentioned earlier that one of the pillars that the governor focused on was trying to provide a health and safety buffer zone around oil and gas wells that are either new or reworked. And SB 1137 addresses that, recognizing that over 2 million people in California live within 3,200 feet of an oil well or gas well. And so this law is novel and calls for these buffer zones that provide safety or buffer zones for schools, childcare centers, homes, and community resources centers and hospitals within those 3,200-foot buffer zones. The year before, in 2021, the legislature enacted SB 1, and SB 1 is a program focused on projections where sea level is anticipated to rise by 7 feet at the end of this century, with about 2/3 of the population located in coastal counties. The idea here is to anticipate and get ahead of that through planning and recognizing that a retrofit's more expensive. And so SB 1 establishes a comprehensive plan for the California Coastal Commission to account for sea level rise in its planning. Natural working lands policy was established a year or two ago in an executive order by Governor Newsom calling for 30% of the land in California and 30% of the coastal zone in California to be protected to allow for natural sequestration of carbon. So this policy of natural and working lands is further implemented through Assembly Bill 2278 and 1757, which basically calls for state agencies to not only prioritize where to establish these protected zones, but to set particular targets for the natural sequestration, with several state agencies leading the way. And Senate Bill 27, which passed the year prior, establishes a carbon sequestration registry for these lands ranging from wetlands and forests to farmland. And then SB 852 deals with carbon adaptation and resiliency, and it gives cities and counties authority to establish climate resiliency districts, and authorizes financing to effectuate that. Electric vehicle and green infrastructure has been part of California policy for several years. California is sort of leading the way with EVs, with the most EVs by far in circulation, and the infrastructure on its way to serve that. And here I'll begin with AB 970. And one of the challenges is to ensure that cities and counties approve the green infrastructure to address range anxiety. And AB 970 was passed not this year, but the year before. That's being implemented over the course of 2 years. And it basically establishes permit streamlining timeframes for cities and counties to approve applications for EV infrastructure, with a date for permits being deemed complete and then approved. I helped write this bill, and I do a lot of work in this space, and I think it will go a long way to speed up the introduction of EV infrastructure. AB 1236 has been around for a few years, and it's another law that requires cities and counties to speed up their approval, and essentially limits their authority to only administrative approvals, except they can step in if there are health and safety considerations and may be required to issue a conditional use permit. So that framework was adopted this year in SB 1291 to try to provide permit expediting for hydrogen fueling. So that same framework is now in place and becomes effective January 1st to promote hydrogen fueling infrastructure as well. The Air Resources Board has paved the way for electrifying trucks, and established as a phase-in for the purchase of trucks that are electric beginning in 2024. And by 2035, most trucks will have to be electric. So something to think about when you're thinking about your budgets and your fleet management. Similarly, a couple of years ago, the Air Resources Board was authorized by legislation to establish a smog check program for the first time the diesel trucks. So this is a reminder that that law will be implemented beginning in 2023, which establishes the smog check during that calendar year moving forward. And then the Air Resources Board is implementing a recent California law that is going to phase out the yellow iron equipment that's referred to as small off-road engines. And these small off-road engines will be phased out and need to be electrified over time, beginning in 2024 with lawn and outdoor equipment. And then in 2028, portable generators and pressure washers and other equipment will need to be electrified as well. The Diablo Canyon Power Plant operated by PG&E was scheduled to phase down and close out by 2024, but the governor signed SB 846 to give it an additional 5 years and to make it easier to relicense so that California can manage the peak demand as other energy sources are coming online. And then with all the wildfire issues connected to the transmission distribution lines and vegetation impacting it, SB 884 was established to expedite utility undergrounding of the utility infrastructure. And then lithium batteries are now added to the Electric Waste Recycling Act, which establishes a fee to support the cost of recycling lithium batteries, which are becoming more in vogue or in play. And then the Integrated Waste Management Act, which has been around for quite a while, calls for cities and counties to divert their non-hazardous solid waste from landfills, calling for a 50% reduction from baseline levels. And AB 1857 adjusts what is allowed for meeting the definition of recycling for diversion purposes and excludes incineration from the calculation. Coastal legislation involves AB 2160, where cities and counties are empowered to waive fees for coastal development permits to allow for public access or habitat restoration. And AB 1832 prohibits leasing for extracting hard minerals from state tidelands and waters. Water availability and supply continues to be a problem, especially in light of the mega drought. And SB 1157 builds on recent California law calling for the public water systems like East Bay Mud and San Francisco PUC and others to increase water efficiency for the ratepayers and established a graduated downward water usage per capita. And the goal prior to SB 1157 was to bring that down to 50 gallons per capita daily by the end of this decade. And SB 1157 is more ambitious and calls for bringing it down to 42 gallons by the end of this decade. Wildfire management remains a big challenge in California, and the legislature for the last several years has put a lot of energy into addressing wildfire risk and management. And SB 896 provides incentives for defensible space. 926 is a pilot program for prescribed burns, addressing the liability associated with that. And then AB 522 extends a exemption for timber harvest plans that with respect to preventing forest fires. AB 2344 is an interesting bill because it deals with the significant number of vehicle collisions that occur not only with deer but other wildlife and roadkill, and the numbers are pretty significant in terms of wildlife that is lost and impacts to vehicles and insurance. And so AB 2344 is focused on requiring Caltrans to identify areas in the state where they could establish overpasses or underpasses or other opportunities to allow wildlife to move past the highway infrastructure. It's no surprise to anyone here that the homelessness challenge remains, and housing is expensive in terms of mortgages and rent. And the legislature has been quite busy these last several legislative sessions producing a great number of bills designed to override city and county authority and establish incentives and carrots and sticks, that is, to bring about more housing units. So here's just a smattering of the last couple of years. And then this legislative session, the Middle Class Housing Act was approved, which essentially allows for or takes into account that retail is on the decline, at least at the curbside, and office space is also less robust in light of the pandemic. With all this extra space and the need for housing, the Middle Class Housing Act basically establishes or allows for housing in zones that are focused on retail and office. And it promotes that more expansive zoning approach with some exceptions. And for example, the new projects for housing must address procedural due process and then also be in alignment with SB 375 for sustainable community strategies. And then AB 2011 is similar. It basically establishes or gives a ministerial approval for 100% affordable housing projects and mixed income housing as well in commercial corridors. Same idea. One thing I should emphasize that's more in Eric's space on the federal level, but worth noting because of its implications here in California, the Obama administration in its waning days passed a inflation cost of living law that dramatically increases the penalties for violations of federal environmental statutes, from the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act to the Resource Conservation Recovery Act for hazardous waste and underground tanks. And you can see that the penalties have dramatically increased 2 to 3-fold per day per violation. So you're talking about significant penalties. And what's interesting is that these penalties now, in most cases, in fact, virtually all cases, are higher than the California statutory violations. So this presents some interesting perspective around enforcement with federal and state agencies, and how that will unfold is unknown. And then lastly, on enforcement, not last year, but the year before, the Bay Conservation Development Commission established a new policy under AB 2809 to try to deliver a more even-handed approach to enforcement of the BCDC laws, establishing procedures for managerial review of staff enforcement decisions. So I'll conclude by just sharing just some thoughts that are not mine, but are from Kip Lipper. Many of you know Kip has had his fingerprints on many of the major environmental statutes in California, serving as the chief environmental aide to the Senate pro tem. His thoughts are that climate policy will continue to be front and center, as will be housing. And I'll add that wildfire policies and water management will also be there as well. With the ultra super majorities that and a number of new legislators finding their way in the Capitol building, there could well be quite ambitious and continued focus on environmental policies as well, because that reflects the public sentiments in the polls. And with ultra super majorities in both houses, we could see continued focus on these environmental policies as we move forward. With that, I will then turn it over to Eric, and then we'll address questions after that.
Gary, Gary, thank you for the great presentation. Eric, I'm just going to give a quick presentation of who you are. That was insightful, Gary, everything you provided. Eric Sapirstein is next up, and Eric is the president of ENS, ENS Resources. How's that? And Eric is based in Washington, D.C., and he does a phenomenal job on working for his different clients on issues related to any issues in Washington, D.C. And he represents a number of California entities as well as outside of California. And with this, I'd like to now turn it over to Eric Sapirstein.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Gary. So it's really good to be back with you folks, partly because when I last spoke to you, I made some predictions, and I think they probably shook out pretty well overall about what would happen with the elections. I think a couple of thoughts before I get into the sort of the meat of the presentation. First of all, we've all heard and seen the results of the past year with respect to infrastructure financing, and the year before, but infrastructure financing, and then most recently the Inflation Reduction Act. Notable that the Inflation Reduction Act really is the sort of the final resolution, if you will, for the Biden administration on climate policy at the federal level. And most important, the way the Inflation Reduction Act is structured to deal with climate impacts generally is through the use of, call it, market incentives, that is, tax credits for doing clean energy projects for the most part. And it's important for two reasons. One, there's a lot of money in the Infrastructure Reduction Act in the form of tax credits, but a significant change was included in the law. And that is that if you are a public entity, you may take those tax credits and either transfer it to another entity that has a higher tax liability, which in this case would be any organization that's private from a public perspective, or you can seek an equivalent cash subsidy. So if you had clean energy, meaning clean electricity generation projects that you wanted to put together, you could take advantage as a public agency or as a private sector agency or in a public-private partnership to secure assistance to bring down dramatically the overall costs of the project. Generally speaking, the assistance is directed towards production of 1 megawatt of energy per day versus larger projects. There is obviously funding assistance for larger projects, but the focus is really to figure out ways to do 1 megawatt and lower, 1 megawatt or lower projects. So from a overall perspective of 2022, that really is the big issue that was secured over the past several months and is now subject to public comment, to the Treasury Department's implementing the tax credit provisions. And once that's finalized and the rule is issued, the opportunities to do project financings will take hold. The second thing that has happened in 2022 that I just want to draw your attention to that we've talked about in the past is the Build America, Buy America mandates. And essentially that is now in the process of being implemented. The effective date is May 14th of 2022. The key point that I want to make now is that with this new mandate, any project, and this really is going to go to the public sector writ large as opposed to the private sector, any funding that goes to a port project or goes to a water project or goes to a wastewater project and anything in between that is infrastructure related will have to comply with Buy America mandates for both iron and steel and manufactured products. To the extent that you can't comply with the mandate, you will have to go to the agency of note to secure a waiver from the mandate. And that could be quite cumbersome because we're still waiting for the implementation guidance to be finalized at many agencies. The Office of Management Budget is going to theoretically put out some kind of regulation to define de minimis amounts that would be exempt automatically from any kind of mandate. But generally speaking, this is sort of a, I won't call it a hiccup, but it's another hurdle to overcome if you take federal money to use it as the project recipient. And that's very important. The project recipient of the federal funding is going to be the responsible party to seek a waiver, for example. It can't be done by a manufacturer, for example. So going forward, this is one of the things that you'll want to be aware of if you accept federal assistance for a water infrastructure project. And I would also put this one finer point on it. If you accept federal assistance, it's not just for that component that's funded by the federal assistance. The entire project will subsequently become subject to Buy America mandates. So as we are talking today, Congress is returning to active work, or at least is trying to return to active work. The congressional leadership essentially just met with the president and talked about what the lame duck will or will not be able to secure. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But I do want to suggest a couple of things. First of all, the lame duck session that we're in now is slated to end on December. Can we go back to the other slide for a second, Sophie? The lame duck session for the time being is going to expire on December 16th when full governmental funding on the stopgap measure expires. We don't expect that date is real. Congress has a way of essentially punting the ball until it absolutely can't punt it any further. And sort of life and politics work in strange ways. And in this circumstance, a couple of weeks, I guess about a week to 10 days ago, the Supreme Court denied former President Trump's request to keep his tax records away from Congress. The court rejected it without comment. You probably saw it in the papers. Why that's important is that it signals that the Justice Department, the Treasury Department is going to submit the tax records for the past several years to the House Committee on Ways and Means. And with the imminent assumption of Republican control of the House of Representatives, the current Democratic majority is going to need as much time to review those tax records and figure out how they're going to use them before they have to give up control of the gavel to the incoming Republican majority. So that all that adds up to the fact that we will be working in Washington, or at least trying to work in Washington, right up to Christmas Eve. The new Congress convenes for the 118th Congress on January 3rd. So it's conceivable they could even take a few days off for Christmas, and then the Speaker in the House and the Senate Majority Leader in the Senate could call members back to continue work. So as we go forward with what's happening with the lame duck, and as we talk about what the next year looks like, keep in mind that one thing is certain, aside from death and taxes, Washington is always a ball of confusion. Okay, next slide. Okay, so Sophie, next slide, thank you. So what I want to go into in more detail is the lame duck session priorities, the election impacts and the consequences, and what to expect in 2023 when margins are a hair's width, and they are a hair's width in both the House and the Senate. We've got, for the purposes of looking forward, we will still have an evenly divided House and Senate for all intents and purposes, and I'll get into a little bit of that in a matter of minutes. But these areas capture sort of what's capturing congressional attention. Next slide. So the lame duck session, as I mentioned, it expires on December 16th or bust. And I think the emphasis should be on bust. We will be here till the 23rd, 24th. I mentioned a bit about the Trump tax credits. The other compelling reason you could make that this is going to be a longer lame duck session is that Christmas falls over on the weekend. And so there's no reason that members can't get home for Christmas on Saturday, the 24th. So December 23rd looks like the likeliest time that we will see Congress break. If in fact miracles do happen and they cut a deal on the pressing issues, then I guess they would go home right away. But it is a limited agenda. Most lame ducks are, before they happen, are held up as a great opportunity to get things done. And sometimes that happens to be the case, but other times you end up with a limited agenda with limited productivity in the development of any kind of final legislative agreements. But for us, the lame duck session right now is targeting the fiscal year 23 appropriations or an omnibus spending bill, which includes funding for full rest of the year's funding that started on October 1st of this year, going through to September 30th of 2023. There's a couple of reasons why it's important for the omnibus bill to get passed into law. The first one is just certainty by the federal agencies that they can carry out many of the activities that they would like to carry out that are theoretically or actually new program initiatives. If they don't get a final spending bill together, the agencies are precluded from doing new work. They can only fund existing activities. The second reason that the omnibus spending bill is important is for the first time in about a decade, Congress included earmarks, otherwise known as community project directed funding for water, wastewater, ports, and whatever else is out there from a public purpose activity. Those activities would disappear, those project fundings would disappear with a snap of a finger if there is a continuing resolution and for the year as opposed to an omnibus spending bill. Again, that's because you can't start new projects under a continuing resolution. Now, all the key appropriators in the Senate and the House have indicated a desire to do an omnibus spending bill. And we have to be optimistic that this will get done. In for many reasons, a lot of the members of the Appropriations Committee, leadership-wise, are retiring. And so they want to see a final bill put into law. So, there is a sense of pride and ownership in the development of a final spending bill, because that's what the appropriators are supposed to do. They're not supposed to continue funding the government on a stopgap basis. So over the next week to 2 weeks, we're going to see a lot of noise about, oh, we can't reach agreement on overall spending. So if we can't reach agreement on overall spending, we can't move any spending bills. Bottom line on this one is most of the subcommittees of the Committee on Appropriations, there are 12 spending bills. These subcommittees have been busy negotiating quietly behind the scenes during the recess to figure out if there is what we call top line overall spending levels. If in fact there's agreement reached the top line, that they can quickly go to put together the final spending packages for each of the 12 federal budgets, if you will, and then move them quickly to the House and the Senate for final approval and passage, and then enactment by the president. Part of the challenges with the appropriations bill are what we call anomalies and add-ons at the last minute. And one of those is Ukraine, and the other is more funding for COVID research, vaccinations, and what have you. And there seems to be some pushback from members of Congress, primarily on the Republican side, about including that kind of funding in the omnibus or in a continuing resolution. So they have to work out those sort of sub top line issues. But again, optimistic that we will get a deal in the final analysis. The other reason that we may have a challenge in extending the lame duck session and moving it to the end of December is the ongoing question of, will the rail system go on strike? Later this week, the House is expected to mandate a union contract be put into place to prevent the strike. The challenge, as always, is the United States Senate, where you need 60 votes, and it's unclear whether 60 votes exist to pass the requirement that the union agreements that were negotiated during the fall, late summer during the fall, would be adopted. So we just have to wait and see how that happens. But that's another reason the lame duck will be extended. So from a substance point of view, excuse me, let me go back 1 second. On the appropriations front, assuming that we do get an omnibus spending bill, from a Bay Planning Coalition point of view, the Corps of Engineers will have approximately $300 million of unallocated O&M, operations and maintenance, budget resources. What that means is that the Corps, which right now is awash with funding due to the infrastructure law and general appropriations, the Corps will have a boatload of money to deal with dredging. And we are hoping that with that extra money, $300 million, that extra resource base will allow them to actively pursue beneficial use of dredge material. I would highlight the fact, and many of you may know this already, but I would highlight the fact that recently the Corps of Engineers allocated approximately $19 million to the San Francisco Bay pilot project for construction activity. That's a first. I have to give recognition to the Bay Area delegation members who pushed very hard for this funding to be released. And so for the first time in ages, there is construction money dedicated to the pilot project for San Francisco Bay estuary needs and rebuilding shorelines and what have you. So going forward to the National Defense Authorization Act. This law, which has to be passed every year, basically provides the Pentagon with the authority to spend its budgetary resources. The reason it's important this year is that when the Senate moved their National Defense Authorization Act, they included as an amendment the Senate Water Resources Development Act of 2022. And this was done with the understanding on the House side that this would be a backstop, if you will, for final passage of a WRDA bill if time runs out during the lame duck session to have a full-fledged debate on a separate bill. At this stage of the game, two things seem almost certain. One, that an agreement on a final conference bill has been reached by the House and Senate WRDA committees. And a couple of sort of last minute items that need to be negotiated between the leaderships of the House and Senate committees. But at the end of the day, it looks like we will have a WRDA bill with a focus on environmental infrastructure, a focus on the Corps dedicating more energy and resources to resiliency projects to reduce flood threats, to reduce coastal erosion threats, all things that will work to the advantage of the Bay Area. So if in fact, as we expect, the WRDA bill is rolled into the National Defense Authorization Act, probably will see this voted on by the House of Representatives in the next, say, 10 odd days, go to the president and be signed into law. So that is sort of the limited agenda. I know it seems incredibly limited, but that's where we're at right now. Of course, there always are the unknowns that pop up in the last minute, like the rail strike. There could be other things that come up. There is the Marriage Equality Act that the Senate will vote on later this week and final, if not tonight. That's already passed the House. So that seems like an easy one, and the votes are there in the Senate, the 60 vote threshold. So this Congress will go down in history as basically codifying marriage equality, and that's a good thing. Looking forward, we started this Congress 2 years ago. I don't think anybody would have predicted that would happen. Okay, next slide. All right, so election impacts and consequences. This it has an impact, obviously, right now on the lame duck, but more importantly, in the next Congress, the 118th Congress. I thought that this New Yorker cartoon or cover that was appeared shortly after the November 8th elections on November 21 says it all. It was a low tide, to be kind, with respect to the votes that came in for the Republicans versus the Democrats in the House. Similarly, in the Senate, basically status quo. A couple of things I want to point out that have consequences due to the election impacts. The House majority that's incoming that it is likely, and I'll talk about that in a second, likely to be run by Kevin McCarthy from Bakersfield. 3 to 4 vote House majority. Nancy Pelosi had a 4 vote House majority over the past couple of years. the thing that I would like to emphasize here is that Nancy Pelosi had a spine of steel, and she was able to keep her various members in line. But her various members that she had to keep in line, by and large, was a small handful of members in the Progressive Caucus. Other members who may have been unhappy with some of the votes they had to take were not necessarily sort of a do or die stance on any given vote. Kevin McCarthy has a bigger problem on his hand. He has probably 2 or 3 different, call it caucuses, if you will, within his conference that will impact his ability to get things done. In fact, I would say that the political weirdness that's going to be rising to the surface in the next several weeks is a little bit like a sort of like putting your hand in a dam that's sprung a leak and then another leak appears elsewhere. It's just going to be completely difficult to control the situation, I think. One of the things to keep in mind is we still have the Georgia elections that have to decide who will come to Georgia, become this Georgia senator. If Raphael Warnock wins re-election, the vote in the Senate will be a 1-vote Democratic majority, and that's important because the Senate Democrats will have a committee structure where they have 1 vote in the majority on everything that they consider. Right now, the Senate committees are divided equally among the 2 parties, and that leads to essentially all too often stalemate on issues that have to be reported out to the full Senate. So that's why it's important the Georgia election on December 6th carries so much weight. And if the Georgia election does send back Raphael Warnock as opposed to Herschel Walker to the Senate, that will probably do more to Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell to say, okay, Democrats have control of the Senate. They don't have 60 votes, but I don't want to be in a situation where we're still working on last year's issues in 2023, meaning he'll probably signal to his membership that we need to finalize the spending bills. Let's clean the slate as much as possible and move on to 2023. I mentioned the House leadership rule, how tenuous it is. Kevin McCarthy, as I said, will have a 3 to 4 vote House majority. You need 218 votes to be in the majority in the House. Here's the key issue. With 218 votes, that's great, but you for everything to vote on and get it through the House to the Senate or to the president's desk, whatever the bill is. But it also requires 218 votes to be voted in as Speaker of the House. And that Speaker of the House situation is really important from a process standpoint because the Speaker is a constitutional officer. So when they vote on the House floor, Kevin McCarthy needs 218 votes. Right now, Kevin McCarthy has elicited from 2 of the more right-wing members of his conference statements that they will not vote for Kevin McCarthy. Okay, so at this stage of the game, he's down by 2 votes. He's 218. He's right on the cusp of not having 218 votes. There are 5 to 6 other Republican members who oftentimes would rather burn the House down rather than vote with their party. And so if Kevin McCarthy, who has pledged to take his speakership candidacy to the House floor, if he were to lose the vote on the House floor, it is sort of a constitutional crisis because without a speaker, the Congress cannot convene in the sense of appointing, members and what have you to committees. You can't swear in new members. You need that speaker. So in the next several weeks, pay attention to what the gossip on the internet and in the newspapers and on the news is with respect to how Kevin McCarthy is coalescing the votes necessary to win the majority. Right now, it's a flip of the coin, and we just have to wait and see. The other thing I would like to mention is the fact that as a result of the election, we're having a generational shift, particularly on the House side with the Democrats. So Nancy Pelosi, as you all know, announced that she will step down as Speaker, but will stay in the House of Representatives. When she did that, Steny Hoyer, the longtime majority leader in the House of Representatives, agreed to step down too. And then finally, James Clyburn from South Carolina, who was responsible for resurrecting Joe Biden's campaign to be president, announced he would step down from the number 3 position, paving the way for a new generation of Democratic leaders who are as follows. Hakeem Jeffries will be the next Democratic leader from New York City. Catherine Clark from Massachusetts will become the number 2 Democratic leader. And then from California, Pete Aguilar will become the number 3 Democratic leader position. What I would say to you is this is a huge change. The average age of the current Democratic leadership is 80 odd years. The new age of the generational shift leadership in the Democratic side of the equation is about 50 to 55 years, a 30-year differential overnight. And the other thing I would point out to you is that the Democrats have decided to be more like Republicans in this shift, i.e. very orderly transition, no drama, if you will. Whereas the Republicans seem to have adopted the Democratic modus operandi, which is lots of drama, lots of questions, lots of uncertainty. And this is all because of the election and the turnout and the consequences. Okay, next slide, please. So election impact and consequences continue. I thought maybe in the interest of fun facts, I mentioned the House Democratic leadership average age drops by 30 years, and the Republican leadership contest is subject to political winds, i.e. the sort of the Freedom Caucus that you read about, and maybe the Problem Solvers caucuses, things like that, that will generate either unity or disunity. At this point, if you look at what's going on, probably more of chaos over the next couple of weeks than unity. There are 46 to 57 odd freshmen. There are 12 freshmen. Here's a key fact: 12 freshmen that lack government experience. That's a big thing. Usually you see freshmen that sort of like the farm league, they come up from local and state government to the federal role. 17 members are between the ages of 20 and 30 years. 57 members are 40 to 50 years of age. 3 members attended the January 1st riot. Colorado, Illinois, and Oregon are sending their first Latinas to office. Pennsylvania is sending its first Black woman to Congress. And the first openly gay House Republican is coming to Congress. So all of this signal that as a result of the election, there are both political but also fundamental change occurring in Congress. And it's similar in the Senate, where you have essentially status quo, but you can see that members, younger members, are asserting themselves more and more every day, and you can see that with the fact that John Fetterman from Pennsylvania is coming to Congress and replacing Pat Toomey, who is a long time senator from Pennsylvania. Okay, so next slide, Sophie. Okay, so what can we expect in Congress when the margins literally are a hair's width wide? Everybody likes to say that there's going to be gridlock. And while the average person would be correct in assuming that this is a recipe for gridlock, let me sort of give you first a sense of what we can see. First of all, House and Senate will take different paths. And that's simply because of who controls the gavel, if you will. You know, Kevin McCarthy has made clear that they are going to take a close look at how we are going forward in this country with respect to policies like immigration and what have you. The Senate, on the other hand, is going to defend the administration. That's not unusual. They're in charge. And we're coming into a presidential election year. The House, its priority is to hobble the administration on priorities that the House majority believes is at odds with their policy positions. And they have the gavel, and the House, most importantly, is ruled by the gavel. So there's a lot of authority there, even though I said that the majority is thin, they still have the gavel. Reorganizing committee leadership and membership will be the first order of business after members are born into the 118th Congress. From a House perspective, there will likely be a decision on the Democratic side to copy what the Republicans have had in place for several years, which is imposing term limits on chairs and ranking members, depending on majority control. And that could create a round robin of changes on the committees if, in fact, they decide to make this change retroactive. Membership, number of slots have opened up, generally speaking, due to retirements or defeats, but generally speaking, most of the committees of jurisdiction that we at the Planning Coalition are concerned about will still hold a sort of strong preference to support the Corps of Engineers, to support infrastructure project funding and what have you. So I don't see a radical shift in what the sort of focus will be of the committees with respect to, call it, discipline or program support. What I do see, though, because of the slim margins, is that the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a bipartisan caucus of members in the House, in fact, it raises the question, aren't you sent to Congress to solve problems? Why do you need a caucus? But notwithstanding that, they will play a role because they command 50 plus votes. The Freedom Caucus, which is the right wing of the Republican Party, will see a number of its members, most notably Jim Jordan from Ohio, sitting in charge of the Judiciary Committee. And then the Progressive Caucus on the Democratic side will challenge the new Democratic leadership on the policies and positions that the party should take as a loyal opposition. All of these three caucuses, if you will conspire to make governing difficult in the House. And we'll just have to see how it unfolds. But right now, these are the folks, or the caucuses, and the factors that contribute to what may or may not happen in the next Congress. One thing that's clear, and it's been stated already by Jim Jordan and other members and Kevin McCarthy, in the House, it will be oversight, oversight, and oversight. Whether it's Hunter Biden or the way the infrastructure money is being used. It doesn't really matter. It's going to be oversight. And in fact, that's probably the essence of the next, at least from the year 2023 leading up to the 2024 year of election preparations for the presidency. From specific legislative initiatives, a couple of things to keep your eye on. The Farm Bill has to be renewed by the end of September of 2023. We see, because of the climate issues, we see a focus on water, most likely continuing with Farm Bill. That's important because other climate-related endeavors or initiatives seem highly unlikely in the next year's time, given the passage of the IIJA and the IRA. Debt limit increase. This is sort of the financing equivalent of Armageddon for folks on the Hill. Without the debt limit increase, which is basically increasing the amount of bonds that the federal government can issue to pay already spent money if you will, or appropriated funds. The government cannot pay down its debt, thereby jeopardizing the full faith and credit of the United States government. So we'll see that as a big deal in the next year, coupled with the fiscal year 2024 appropriations. We've had these debt limit increases in the past because it's so difficult to find consensus over increasing the debt limit. They usually in Congress end up combining it with the 2020, whichever year appropriations were in, combining it in the appropriations bill to gather up enough votes to pass it and send it to the president. We'll see, but that's the other key point I want to point out. And then finally, reconciliation. This is the budgetary process by which decisions are made that can't be, they aren't subject in the Senate to filibusters. I think that you'll see, particularly on the House side, efforts to move a reconciliation bill that might, and I have the might, emphasize the word might, roll back some of the administration's climate policies and or seek to rescind some of the already appropriated funding related to climate programs. Whether that will be successful or not remains to be seen. Obviously, that's not going to pass easily in the Senate with Democratic control, but keep your eye on reconciliation because that's the one vehicle where Congress can find ways to change past decisions. And then finally, the unknowns, scandals, retirements. And when I wrote this, I said the Grim Reaper, and I didn't realize that a member of Congress would pass away literally on the evening before I was going to give this presentation. But Donald McKeechan, a Democrat from Virginia, unfortunately passed away yesterday after a long illness with cancer. So two things have happened. One, it illustrates how tenuous the majority in the House is. And there is historical precedents where the majority is so thin, and if members either retire or caught up in scandals or unfortunately pass away, that you literally can see control switch overnight to the other party simply because of the loss of a member. So McKeechan unfortunately has passed away. That gives Kevin McCarthy a 1 vote majority increase. But as we say, nothing is ever certain. As we sit here today, Arizona is in the midst in one county of trying to decide whether or not that county will be able to certify the election results. And if they don't certify the election results, a Republican member who barely won election to the House of Representatives will now lose 13,000 votes because they can't certify one area of the district. And that means that the Democrat who lost the vote will now win the vote because of the refusal to certify this one area within the congressional district in Arizona. So these are the unknowns. We don't know what's going to happen, but we're basically looking at sort of a free-for-all of opportunities, and this is in the next several weeks leading up to January 3rd, when in fact Congress will convene and see what happens. Next slide. So let me end on an optimistic note. There are several instances in the past, and most recently in the last 2 years, where narrow margins and prognosticators say gridlock prevents work from getting done. As I said, the past 2 years saw some amazing passages of legislation signed into law to make the most investment ever in infrastructure, to put in place programs to support climate resiliency. And I would note that prior to World War I and World War II, and even the Great Depression, there were narrow margins leading up to both those moments in time in history. And Congress came together and passed meaningful legislation to support addressing the needs. And so I think you have to be an optimist to stay in this line of work. And I am suggesting to you that as we enter 2023, notwithstanding notwithstanding the close margins and everything else, I think we're possibly looking at still some kind of bipartisan work over the next year to a year and a half. So with that, thank you very much. And John or Mara, I will turn it back to you, or I guess Tim.
Yes, thank you. So I've been monitoring both the question and answers and the chat, and it seems that most folks have been able to put questions in the chat. And I do want to get to some of those questions. I will be posing them. And if you have more, feel free to continue to put them in the question and answer function. You'll notice that some questions, it says that they were answered. And that was me actually making a note in the response to the question that I will pose these questions. So the first question I will ask is posed by Michael Barber, and this is for Gary, and he wants to know how we are going to reach carbon neutrality goals if we are still selling natural gas appliances, which have roughly a 20-year lifespan. And he says the same for gas-powered vehicles. So I realize that the Air Resources Board has a lot to achieve here, but Gary, I'll pose that to you.
Yeah, well, carbon neutrality is 2045. I mean, there's so many factors in play, and I would just suggest there's a lot of detail in the scoping plan that speaks to exactly the mechanics and strategies and how the curves will unfold with the phasing down of fossil fuels, so from industry, appliances, all the contributing factors. So it's all part of the scoping plan that accounts for that actually happening. And I think in the plan it says something like they'll exceed the goal to 89% instead of 85% with all the factors in play. So according to the plan, they will get there. So I would refer the questioner to the plan for the mechanics beyond what I just shared.
Fair enough. Do you think that the plan, do you think that that we will need to revise any of the carbon neutrality goals as it gets closer?
So, I mean, everything's based on, predictions. And so there's so many other factors in play. I mean, if you look at wind energy, and that could be sort of an X factor among many others that we just don't know about, right? But if you just look at wind energy and all the effort going into bringing that online, that could be a bonanza of green electrons that could offset so much of what's going on. So yeah, absolutely. I suspect, and the scoping plan comes out every 5 years. So it's been a work in progress. And with all the feedback loops, it's distinctly possible that there will be a need to revisit because there's so many variables right now. So I'll leave it at that, saying, yeah, every 5 years they have to look at it. And the assumptions and predictions are all in play.
Fair enough. A very good question just came in the Q&A, so I will pose this one to Eric. Regarding the potential rollback of federal legislation through reconciliation, doesn't the fact that some members of the Republican conference have taken advantage of federal monies for their home districts make the rollback more unlikely?
So it's certainly going to make it more difficult to get the votes in place. And that gets to the point of how does the leadership on the Republican side marshal support for any initiatives, whether it's reconciliation or otherwise. I think there's an old saying about consistency is the hobgoblin of politics. And I think the answer really comes down to this. If in fact, the leadership has the clout to force everybody, much like I mentioned with Nancy Pelosi as a current speaker, to force the membership to sort of walk a straight line with them, then that issue, which is a legitimate issue, somewhat recedes as being compelling. But I think the question's a good one, and we just have to see how strong the leadership is with its votes.
Okay, I'll kind of bounce back and forth, but there will be questions for both of you. I'll also ask a question that Ann Spalding put in the chat, and this is for Gary. Are leaf blowers, generators, and lawnmowers included in the ARB requirements to go electric?
Hi, Ann. I haven't seen you in years, but nice to get your question. Yeah, absolutely. That's they phase out in 2024 and 2028. So leaf blowers and other lawn equipment in 2024, and the more industrial equipment in 2028. Based on it began with state legislation, and now it's morphed into promulgated Air Resources Board rules that speak to those timelines.
Great. There are a couple, there were several questions and comments from Michael Warburn. He was very active in the chat. And I will pose a couple of them slightly differently than the way that he posed them, but I think that they make most sense to direct to the different people. So when Gary was speaking, Michael asked about what about fossil fuel subsidies. And I believe, and Gary, you can correct me on this, that fossil fuel subsidies are more likely or more in place at the federal level. And I'm unaware of continuing fossil fuel studies at subsidies at the state level. If you're aware of specific ones, feel free to chime in. But I will pose this first to Eric to see if there's any threat to fossil fuel subsidies at the federal level. And then Gary, if you're aware of any specific ones at the state level, you can jump in too. So Eric first.
So this may be an escapist response, but I'm going to say that the threat to fuel subsidies is only as strong as there is no filibuster in the Senate. I think that if you're going to go after subsidies, I guess that sort of makes me think that we're going after a larger tax bill. We're going after dealing with, and there has been a lot of discussion about making permanent the Trump era income tax rates. And so, you know, there's a possibility that in order to do what we call pay-go, which is to offset either lost revenues or new spending, you have to make cuts somewhere else. I guess you could envision, whether it's fuel subsidies or other subsidies out there, that, you know, maybe, just maybe, you could see that threat. But does that really manifest itself in an actual change? Hard to see in the next year or so, particularly if there's a recession coming down the pike, and then you're in the middle of a presidential election cycle where you've got just a very strong, probably a strong desire not to do too much leading into an election cycle.
And I don't know about oil subsidies at the state level. I would be inclined to agree with you, Tim. And I do know that the governor is focusing on a windfall profits special session coming up soon. And I know that's been bandied about off and on over many decades in California. So I think at the state level, if anything, there's a distinct possibility that there'll be a focus on addressing what is perceived to be the possibility of profiteering. So I'll leave it at that.
Fair enough. Michael also posed a question that he posed while Eric was speaking, but I think it's more appropriately directed to Gary. And the question had to deal with the Coastal Commission conditionally approving a desalination plant in Monterey County recently. And the way that I would phrase this is, what do you think this means as a precedent for desalination in California, given that it's largely state permitted and state regulated issue?
Yeah, I can just say that I know about 7, 8, maybe 10 years ago, the legislature passed a law that really did focus in on addressing water supplies through desalination, notwithstanding the environmental issues and the prodigious energy it takes to generate desalinated water. And that's becoming a big, my understanding is a big part of the equation to address water scarcity in California. And I know about that particular project just lightly, just where I know the nearby, it was an environmental justice issue where the water was going to be made available more to Pacific Grove, Monterey, and Carmel, and not the community that will be impacted most. And they argued this was an environmental justice issue, but the overarching decision was made by the Coastal Commission for the larger need, if you will. And even though the state of California is deeply focused on environmental justice and leads the nation, notwithstanding that environmental justice issue, it was overridden by larger concerns. And I think that reflects what will be the future, because the legislature recognizes that desalination will be part of the equation.
And Tim, if I could jump in.
Please do.
So, first of all, it is noteworthy that the commission did what it did, given the history, as Gary talked about, with this area. But from a federal perspective, and what we saw in the IRA and we saw in the infrastructure law, and we've seen in hearings and what have you, particularly with the circumstances of the Colorado River now, that we're not going to be seeing, probably not see huge desal projects being built over the next couple of years. But what we are seeing is a interest from policymakers on, is there a way to put together packages of desal projects that address discrete areas of needs that aren't going to be environmentally negative or adverse. And I think it all comes down to the fact that if we truly are here to be in a period of sustained drought, that you have to have all the tools in the toolbox to your availability. So while the Coastal Commission gave its tentative approval, we still have a ways to go on the project, but I think it's a signal that we're moving forward, looking at desal as long as it's protective of the environment.
Yeah, and what it strikes me is, seems like both with the push for offshore wind and increasing push for desal, there's going to be an increasing focus on sort of oceanic policy, and our emphasis on how we're going to particularly deal with that nearshore environment. So a couple really good questions just came in the chat. I'll start with Dominic Dutra's. Are there statewide large-scale initiatives on the horizon to increase the state's electrical capacity? PG&E and other power agencies are already struggling to find capacity for their power demands of new development. I know there is intent for cleaner energy in greater volume via smaller projects, solar, wind, etc., but it feels demand is outpacing the increase in capacity, especially as we move to carbon neutral energy sources.
Is that directed to me, Tim?
Yeah. I'll let you start with that one. Yeah, thanks, Gary.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, and it's something that's been on my mind as well. And it's not my area of expertise, but I did attend the Yosemite Environmental Law Conference and joined a panel on this topic. And one of the panelists was, I don't recall the gentleman's name or title, but basically the lead in the California Energy Commission. And he shared with us that there's been so much energy, no pun intended there, to really manage the load now and into the future. I recall him saying that we were somewhere in the neighborhood of like 30 to 60 hours a year in play. So that means we're in great shape except for those peak times. And with, as I mentioned earlier, with offshore wind, which is going to blow 24/7, and not the issue we fear or face with domestic or land-based wind, which is only blows at night for the most part. So you've got that, and there's a big focus on energy storage solutions. And I seem to recall him saying that already 5% of the energy demand is already in storage, and there's so much energy, here we go again, no pun intended, focused on energy storage solutions. It just seems to me that we're on track And it's a big focus of the Energy Commission and the CPUC and the infrastructure. So we're on track based on projections, based on what I heard the CEC person share with us.
My awareness is that there was significantly more storage online for the heat event that we had just after Labor Day weekend, and that helped us navigate the heat storm that we had. That they narrowly came close to having blackouts, but they were able to avoid major outages. So
yeah.
that
and
tracks.
I would add too that again, not my area, but what I believe to be on tap is a focus on, the more electric vehicles that come online, there are strategies and technologies that are underway or in place to use the vehicle that stores the energy overnight and can be sending that back to the grid potentially. So there's all kinds of innovative strategies. So I feel like it's doable and manageable from everything I understand to be the case.
Great. Another question from Scott Warner, a little bit lengthy, but I think it's worth it to walk through it. The matter of PFAS and regulation, Gary mentioned it, but noted it was not covered here, covers both state and federal jurisdiction. Some states like California have proposed exceedingly low regulatory limits, and federal agencies are considering listing as hazardous substances. Because of the pervasiveness of the topic, combined with climate and drought issues, should we anticipate any federal decisions, or will states continue to be the primary leaders in setting regulation over the next 2 years? So I'll put that one first to Eric.
So it's a great question. It carries with it a host of impacts. First of all, EPA has issued what we call the strategic roadmap on how they're handling the regulation of the chemical. The most compelling piece of that right now is a proposed rule that is on the street public comment ended on November the 7th, but it would designate 2 members of the PFAS family as hazardous substance under Superfund, thereby potentially, and I emphasize the word potentially, exposing liability to folks who were involved with the disposal of any any substances that contain the chemicals in them, which, as we know, PFAS chemicals are ubiquitous, they're everywhere. And so Congress has tried to legislate liability. It hasn't been able to get the votes. The EPA put this rule out there. The second thing is the EPA is also issuing what we call effluent limitation guidelines to prevent the discharge of PFAS contaminated wastewaters into the wastewater treatment systems. They're looking at source control generally as a way to go. But at the end of the day, PFAS and the demand for treatment technologies and the likelihood that if, as we expect, PFAS chemicals are designated as hazardous substances through Superfund, that the liabilities, even if they're just potential, the consequences are going to be huge with respect to the cost of managing a waste product, for example, that might have PFAS in it. The second thing I would note is with respect to PFAS cleanup, or PFAS in general, the EPA is also going to issue a drinking water standard that will, in many respects, if they go on the path that they're on right now, will be basically a zero detection level. I don't see that absolutely a certainty. I think the EPA will probably end up doing something that is more performance-based than numeric, just because the consequences are people are going to throw up their hands and say, we don't know how to reach this number. It's technologically impossible. But I think, this is one to watch. There is not consensus in Congress because nobody wants PFAS in their water supply. Nobody wants it in the groundwater. But the way to go and deal with it and how to get around the issue of mandating standards that are, practically speaking, unachievable, that's where the focus is going to have to be. And I think that's where Congress is going to be called upon, because EPA is moving forward on its regulatory agenda to essentially put in place standards that will prompt, I think, a congressional review.
Yeah, and I would just add and say hello to Scott, and also that EPA did approve a toxics release inventory under EPCRA standard for reporting PFAS over a specified amount beginning July 1st of each year. So that is already in the federal law. And then to Eric's point, my understanding is that there are other, I don't know if they're rulemakings or projections for the Clean Water Act and other statutes in addition to the Safe Drinking Water Act and also under RCRA. So federally, it's getting a lot of attention, but still somewhat early on. Here in California, the legislature has been focused on PFAS quite a bit, and I don't remember which ones are pending or which ones were enacted, but there's AB 1817, which would or does ban PFAS in textiles. AB 2771, which I do believe passed, which bans PFAS in cosmetics manufacturing, and then AB 2247, which would enhance PFAS public disclosures, and then OEHA, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments, working on a public health goal, which is the precursor to the maximum contaminant level for Safe Drinking Water Act MCLs for PFAS. So there's a lot that's currently happening or has happened at the state level, and will the California's tail wag the dog, or will it happen federally, or will it happen together?
Yeah, and Tim, I would just add one thought that Gary caused me to think about, which is EPA has just put out a study that essentially says the economic impact of what they're proposing with respect to across the board with respect to reporting and what have you. This like Gary was talking about. Originally, they had predicted tens of millions of dollars of economic cost. Now they're saying it's closer to $880 million annually. I think what that tells you is, from a litigation standpoint, if you thought the Waters of the United States rulemaking was a tortuous process, that's just a warm-up. It's like spring training. I think the litigation on PFAS and the rulemakings are going to make a lot of lawyers wealthy, a lot of scientists wealthy, and I think we're going to spend years figuring out what the real route to success is for controlling the chemicals on a regulatory basis.
All right, from a very particular regulatory question to a broader political question, this is for both of you. We'll start with Eric. With the recent election and the changes that took place, do you see the moderates becoming a more influential in the legislative process? So we'll start at the federal level and then we'll go to states.
So I think the quick answer, particularly in the House, is every member of the House is a Joe Manchin because of the narrow margins. I think that what we saw with the IRA and the IIJA that moderation, in other words, we started off at $6 trillion, and we ended up with about a $2.5 trillion infrastructure bill. I think that the pressures of narrow majorities will lead to moderation on sort of the big ticket items. I think the sort of red meat issues are still going to be out there, and that's to satisfy both bases. And so, generally speaking, on the big ticket items, yeah, I think we'll end up with moderation. That's why I was saying I'm optimistic we'll find solutions to problems that are big problems, because the country can't afford it otherwise. So that's my quick response, Tim.
Yeah, and I would just say, as I mentioned earlier, with ultra super majorities of Democrats in both houses, and basically what looks like a juggernaut from the outside looking in, with a governor who's a progressive governor, the only holdout, as some of you know, is notwithstanding those numbers, you have the so-called business-friendly Democrats in the Central Valley who are like light blue, and so they can't always be counted upon for more controversial bills. And so the numbers are there, but and some bills call for a 2/3 supermajority, and on fiscal matters and others, I suspect it's easier to reach that level. But there can be maybe for some oil and gas issues in the Central Valley and Kern County and elsewhere, you could see pushback and not see the Democrat as a reliable vote in the business-friendly context. So mostly progressive, depending on the issue.
And Tim, I would just add one other thought, and that is there's nothing like a crisis to focus the political mind. And so if interest rates remain high, if in fact the Fed delivers as a hard landing, as I'd like to say, with the economy, and we see, unemployment going up, we see growth going down, you could see moderation dictating some kind of legislative response to a recession impact. So I think that's the other thing to keep your eye on with respect to what happens. And that will be also part of, I think, the oversight hearings that we expect to see in both the House and Senate on how the infrastructure monies are being spent.
Okay, I haven't seen a new question come in the chat or the Q&A function, so I will just remind participants that we're still open. We're going for another 19 minutes, and if you have more questions, we'll include them. But I've got some other questions that I'll keep posing until the end, but also until other questions come in. Another one for both Gary and Eric. The Air Resources Board's scoping plan is monumental in its effort and was even highlighted at the recent Conference of the Parties, COP27 in Egypt, in a side event focusing on California's climate leadership. What will it take to get the country, or at least other states, to adopt measure similar to CARB's?
I can take a first stab and just say that California, being the bellwether state that it is, and knowing that the national polls show that climate change sentiment has risen significantly year after year, with somewhere in the neighborhood of close to 2/3 plus of the population nationally believing that climate change is real and human caused, and as more cataclysmic, major extreme events, weather events occur across the country, from flooding to heat waves and so forth, that sentiment is, I would think, would continue driving legislative activity in other states. And at a minimum, there are somewhere in the neighborhood of like 16 or 17 states that are probably blue states that follow California's lead with respect to the Clean Air Act's waiver for its policies that California's adopted and other states have followed. So I would think that at a minimum, a good 15 to 17 states that already follow California's Clean Air Act waiver would step in, and if they haven't already, will adopt the climate policies of the scoping plan.
Eric, do you have
Yeah. So I'd answer it this way. First of all, I agree with Gary, but I would answer it a little differently, which is Elon Musk is getting just lacerated, and I won't make a political comment either way for his behavior with Twitter. But what Elon Musk did, and what it was brilliant, which was he created a network of charging systems, and that's quite frankly what created the desire to own a Tesla, because it wasn't so much range anxiety as much as it was charging anxiety. So the IRA includes $5 billion, if my memory serves me correctly, to roll out a national infrastructure network.
I think that's the IIJA, actually, the infrastructure.
The IIJA, sorry, Tim. The IIJA.
Yeah, that's okay.
And so you've got all this money being poured out to create a infrastructure network to charge cars. So what Gary said is 100% correct, but then layer on top of what Gary was saying, the fact that you're going to create a network of charging stations, assuming they work, that people will now say, first of all, it's really cool to have an electric car because they don't really break and I don't have to take them in for oil changes. But now I know that I can charge the car. And I think that, coupled with what Gary was saying, is going to drive the rest of the country towards California's standards. And also as you said, Gary, it being a bellwether state, California having 10% of the population is statistically significant. So what California does, you guys, set the stage, if you will, for the rest of the country. And we saw it with New England and New York years ago, putting together a climate map.
And I would just add, I'm doing a lot of work in this space for green infrastructure, and it's going to probably be, even with all that money, which is good news for the future, the rub to me is getting permitted stations, and we need, so the money's there, but it takes months and months to develop the engineering drawings. It takes several months or more for cities and counties to approve, even with the permit streamlining. And then you've got the interconnection with the investor-owned utilities and the MUDs. And even if you have everything ready to roll with the land use permitting side and the engineering, you have to ensure that the electricity is there to meet the load. And then I'm not sure if it's the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the others calls for having charging stations on the freeways first every 50 miles. Well, a lot of those, look at the Mojave Desert. Well, they don't have cell towers or the ability to get communication or power. So then they have to bring power to the 50-mile interval. So my point being, it's good news, but it won't happen overnight. And maybe in 2 to 3 years, hopefully, there'll be such breadth of infrastructure across the country that it will pave the way, there I go again, for people being willing to buy the electric vehicle and make that investment, knowing the infrastructure will serve them.
Well, I will say that on the infrastructure issue, one of the things that the EV infrastructure community secured, which is amazing, is the waiver for ultimately 2 years, but it's 1 year, for compliance with Buy American mandates. So at least from a process standpoint, the ability to use infrastructure that's not manufactured in America simply because of supply chain problems is there.
Gary, we came for the puns, and all of the political and policy advice is just free. So keep them coming. So there's a couple more questions in the chat that I'll get to. One says it's from Michael Barber for Gary. Can you provide a little more background regarding AB 852 funding for special districts?
Let's see.
I can pose a question to Eric if you want to.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, we'll get to Eric and then we'll come back to that one. So a particular question about air quality. There's speculation regarding passing increased air quality regulations in the next 12 months at the federal level. Do you think this is actually feasible with the new makeup of Congress and the loss of the Democratic majority in the House?
So I think maybe the way to answer it is that I can see EPA issuing tighter regulations on air emissions, particularly with respect to incineration. We'll go back to Scott Warner's question about PFAS, that you could see standards related to incineration of PFAS, for example. With respect to federal legislation, I have not seen any indication there is a desire to take up the Clean Air Act at this point in time.
Okay, that's helpful. Gary, are you situated on 852 or do you still need more time?
I do just another minute.
Okay, I'll get to another question that's in the chat. Michael Warburton posts, do you see the Coastal States Organization resuming a leadership posture in implementing the common law public trust doctrine? Very specific question.
So, little bit out of my bandwidth. I know about public trust doctrine and everything else. I think that's more of a state issue, isn't it, Gary?
Yeah, what's the question again?
You see the Coastal States Organization, and that was capitalized. So I don't know if that's a particular organization or if that's just reference to coastal states who work together, resuming a leadership posture in implementing the common law public trust doctrine.
Yeah, I just know a little bit about the public trust doctrine, and knowing that you know, the Mono Lake decision was sort of the 1983 law that you know, launched it forward, and it percolates a lot in the background, but beyond that, I don't really follow it, so I'm not sure I can answer that question.
I would say maybe that to answer Michael's question, I think just within the context of climate change, resiliency and everything else, if you're talking about coastal states, clearly they're taking a larger role, and particularly with the Coastal Zone Management Act.
Right, another question
It
just
has
came
some very
through.
strong teeth.
Thanks. Another question came through in the chat. I'll pose it while Gary's still looking at 852. The maritime community nationally would seem to be the canary in the coal mine. This is, by the way, Scott Warner posing the question regarding the integration of climate and economics because of climate impact from rising seas, more intense storms, and the resulting damage and infrastructure security needed. Will red and blue coastal states work together with red inland ag states to secure the maritime industry as climate conditions continue to impact the ports?
Is that to me?
It could go either way. It's sort of coastal states working with inland states. It could be at the federal or state to state level.
So, I mean, the inland states have their own set of concerns and issues, but you saw with the Mississippi River and the drought situation there, you see with the storm surges in New England and elsewhere, I think that you would probably see some kind of collaboration in addressing these types of issues between the states. But the issues are somewhat different. Maybe the solutions are, or maybe the better way to say it, the solutions are going to be somewhat different, but I could see them collaborating and trying to figure out how to deal with these issues as they become more and more of a challenge. And again, as I said at the beginning, the Corps of Engineers is awash in money right now. And so there's opportunities to do things there.
I would just add, if this is an analogy, during the Trump administration, there was a big focus on offshore oil drilling on the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast. And unanimously, Republican governors and Democratic governors in the Atlantic states and the Pacific states all pushed back against that. So if there can be some commonality regardless of the political stripes to address common challenges such as the impact on the maritime concerns.
Okay, and then I do want to close this out a little bit early. Gary, do you have any further?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm just looking at the bill, and as you can tell, this is mostly a headline look because everything's so new, and I'm still getting my hands around it. But I'm happy to work offline with the questioner. I'm looking at the bill. It authorizes cities and counties to, bear with me, to form a climate resilient district to raise and allocate funds for projects and would deem each district to have enhanced infrastructure financing district authority. So there's a financing mechanism to pay for specific projects to address coastal resiliency, and they define eligible projects. I mean, that's pretty much really what it's about. They've got authority to address eligible coastal or climate resilient projects at the city and county level. That's basically what the bill calls for. I'm happy to go offline and speak in a bit more detail.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to close it out. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Gary. Wonderful presentations. Really appreciate your informative answers to the chat. And with that, I will kick it back to John to close. Oh, wait.
I'll just say, just as a reminder, you didn't see it on my slide, but the most recent article, if you want a copy, is entitled 2021 Legislative Update, a Return to Normalcy Post-COVID. And then the article, which will cover the laws we're talking about right now, will be out in a couple of months. So, you know, my contact information is available, and I'm happy to send you a PDF of that once it is published.
Okay, thanks again. John Coleman, back to you.
Great, thank you, Tim. First of all, I'd like to thank all the participants today, for Mara Morrison for kicking us off, and Eric Sapirstein and Gary Lex for being our people in the hot seat, if you want to say that, and then Tim McRae for following up on the discussions that we had today. We heard a lot. Clearly, 2023 is going to be a mixed bag. We'll see what happens in both California and as well as probably more interesting, the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. 2022 BPC was very involved and active. In 2023, we're going to be more so. And I'd also like to thank all our sponsors from 2022 and the Bay Planning staff for helping put this on. And to sort of roll this out, we couldn't have done this without the effort of our sponsors or our staff. Sophie had the lead on this, and Cameron assisted her. If you're not a member of BPC, please check us out and ask us how your organization can benefit. And we'd like to have you join and become active in BPC as we go into 2023. With that, we are going to end the program, and thank you very much, everybody, for your participation.